Welcome to the Invero Show. Join the Invero team and our esteemed clients and partners as we demystify the complexities of Microsoft cloud systems. We hope to help you accelerate your cloud journey and maximize the value of your investment with Microsoft. And now, on with the show.
Good morning, good afternoon to those that have joined. Thank you so much for joining and attending this episode of the Invero Show. We're delighted that you've invested some time here and hopefully you get some value out of the session. Let's kick it off. For those that haven't met me before, welcome. I'm Sean Ambrose. I am part of the leadership team here at Invero, and today and always I am the host of the Invero Show. I'm really pleased and grateful to be joined here with a couple of colleagues and a great partner of ours. So starting with our partner of ours, Jamie Wakeham is here from Microsoft. He leads Azure Cloud Sales for Canada. And then with my colleagues here from Invero, we've got Craig Slack, who's our CTO and founder, and then Sabrina Shaker, who is our cloud solution architect, helping all sorts of our clients architect and modernize on the Azure platform. We are here today to talk about a really interesting topic that has a tremendous amount of market interest out there around what are the options that a client could consider with respect to the rising or just changing cost structures and options around VMware licensing. So let's jump in. Just move along here. So what's our agenda? What are we going to talk about here? I'll just do a brief intro here as the host and the moderator of why is this learning about? I think that's probably pretty intuitive, or because you recognize that on your desire to join the call. But I'll cover it nonetheless. I'll cover just for those that are less familiar with Invero, how does that fit into Invero's go-to-market and our set of capabilities? And then from there, we're gonna make this very conversational. It's gonna be very low on slides and very high on rich dialogue. And so Jamie and Craig are going to have a casual conversation around what are the options that a client could consider, the pros and cons, why, and just unpack that in some great detail here. And then Sabrina is going to come into the conversation and we're going to go a little deeper into the architecture. And so then Sabrina and Craig are going to bounce around a similar version of that conversation, but take it into an architectural point of view. So same thought of like, what are the options and why and how, pros and cons, et cetera. But we're going to look at that from a technical aspect. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with how can we help? Where might you go from here, thinking about all these considerations? Sabrina, Jamie, Craig, you ready?
Let's do it.
Yeah, all right. Fantastic. Okay, thanks. So a little background here. I'm not going to drain this slide. I think everybody knows, again, this is why you joined here. You all will recall that late last year, Broadcom acquired VMware. And so when an organization acquires another organization, sometimes there's changes that happen. And there's a bunch of changes that are evolving here within VMware. It's still a great partnership to Microsoft. Jamie's going to speak to that a little bit here, but there's some change. They're divesting from the VDI platform. They're changing their licensing model. They're changing their socket-based to core-based structures, and the pricing's going to change. So if I was to just summarize all this, and really what we're really going to try and unpack here is, if the licensing charges are changing, what could a client do to think about that, and what are the different approaches to hosting the VMs, and then ultimately whether the pricing is changing or isn't. It creates an inflection point to think about, but like, what's the path of modernization here? Almost irregardless of the licensing change. But if you thought of that as an inflection point to say, okay, I should really think about what to do next, you should probably be doing that anyways. But this change is just maybe driving a little bit more urgency or a little bit more design thinking around, hey, let's make it a bigger priority. So real quick on how does this fit into Invero's go-to-market? There's a lot on this slide. I want to actually just take your eyes quickly to the bottom of Invero's mission. So what's Invero all about? Why do we do what we do? We do it to help clients maximize the value of their investment in Microsoft and make business better. Microsoft tends to be a very strategic partnership and investment for clients, for the majority of clients. So with that, it means there's an inherent kind of responsibility and accountability to make sure if it's a strategic investment, you got to make sure you're getting it right. So that's first and foremost why we are in business. How we go about that is really up on the top left there of, this is what we do. We focus completely on Microsoft and complementary technology. So we're not distracted by other technical things in our line card that dilute our level of focus. In accompaniment to having a great technology bench and capabilities, we've also built out an expert level Microsoft licensing practice. And that's really relevant to this conversation today, because as much as we're talking about architecture, we're also talking about licensing implication, which equals cost. And then last but not least, many of our teammates here from Invero have a deep background working in large enterprise. And we do lots of business in large enterprise, right through the mid-market, even to SMB. But we take that enterprise level depth and perspective and bring that all the way from enterprise through to predominantly the mid-market of Canada. So that's just that little overview on Invero. How it fits in, it's again fairly intuitive here. It's going to fit into our Azure core practice from an infrastructure point of view of what are the right ways to think about your design and your architecture there. But equally, it's going to fit into, well, let's talk about your applications and how do those live within Azure or whatever foundation that you're thinking about. And then last but certainly not least, I touched on a moment ago around the licensing bits here. There's a real big licensing design thinking here as well. So real quick on Invero's go-to-market and how this fits in. Let's keep the conversation rolling. And so here we're gonna drop the slides, and we're just gonna have a casual conversation here between Jamie and Craig, and I'll do my best to facilitate and moderate that around what are the options to consider. So before we dive a little deeper into that, Jamie, maybe you can just give our audience a little bit of an introduction beyond what I had said. Tell us a bit about your role at Microsoft.
Yeah, right on. Well, thank you, Sean, and thanks for having me here today. Invero's been a really fabulous partner for Microsoft over a great many number of years, so I was happy to kind of jump on and help with this important topic. I'm responsible for the Azure business in our mid-market segment here in Canada nationally. So we've got a team of around 50 people spread out across Canada and the US, supporting our customers on their cloud and Azure modernization journey. So lots of different customers, from some of the really small ones to some of the really sizable customers across the country, across all kinds of verticals as well. So happy to be here, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jamie. Maybe I'll start with a question to you around, if you could just unpack, we chatted about this earlier in preparation of this, of what are the options? If we kind of just lay that out a little bit in big bucket, and then we'll unpack them in a bit more detail. So high level, what are the options a client could consider here?
Yeah, for sure. And maybe let me just start with a little bit on some of the why, right? Because we get hit by all kinds of different customers and, really across Canada that are sort of looking for different options. And there's various reasons why they're looking for different options. You touched on one earlier, which is licensing costs can sometimes push you down a particular path. Sometimes it's, customers' data centers are expiring. They're just approaching end of life, and they're sort of trying to find ways to say, hey, what do I do next? Maybe what they have in place today is good, but they are increasing from a capacity perspective. They need more compute capabilities, and it might be temporary, it might be permanent. They could be battling with different security threats. And so the way in which you protect your on-prem data center is a little bit different from the way in which you can protect things in the cloud, different sets of tools and setup parameters that can be used there along the way. Perhaps you're just simply, hey, we want to avoid capital expenditures. We don't want to refresh hardware, refresh software licenses. We'd rather spread some of these things out, by looking at some of the options in cloud models where you can pay for what you need and not have to necessarily pay up front. And ultimately, there's things just like budget constraints. How do we just simply adjust in terms of how budgets are being paid for? And so those are like some of the key reasons why customers will often reach out to us, collectively, Invero or Microsoft, to basically say, hey, what are my options, right? How can we, solve problem X or problem Y at the end of the day? And so what's really great about the cloud, as I think a lot of folks have known and have experience with, is there's not just one solution, not just one pattern. We've got a lot of different options that we can work with customers on collectively. And so some of the simple ones are just, how do we migrate to the cloud? We want to fully exit our data centers. We want to fully, get out of the majority of on-prem. Although I would argue a lot of organizations are still going to have some small edge and local components. But for as much as organizations can, how do we just migrate things fully into the cloud? Other customers might want to sort of put one foot in each side. Hey, I don't want to completely throw out all of my current investments, or I have some local needs. So how can I set up and configure a hybrid mode where I could actually spend some of my compute cycles on-prem and some of my compute cycles in the cloud, and really sort of get the best of both worlds? And then the third option we see is customers are like, okay, I'm done with the on-prem. Just how do I modernize my solution stack? How do I take advantage of SaaS solutions? How do I take advantage of more modern deployment models like containers or app services, and really sort of leverage more modern deployment solutions across the board? And so those are generally the big three ones that we see. You either full on migrate to the cloud, you look at a hybrid model, or you fully embrace a modernization strategy. And there's nuances and complexities and challenges, as well as benefits to each one of those as we sort of go.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jamie. That's a great overview, and just teeing it up from a big bucket. Maybe Craig, a question over to you would be, Jamie used that term modernization a few times there. Let's talk a bit about, what does modernization mean?
Sure. Yeah, and great overview there, Jamie. So thank you for that. Modernization is, I think it's an overused term, to be honest. But if I simplify it from our point of view and customers' point of view, is it's moving away from virtual machines. So moving away from leveraging IaaS, infrastructure as a service, where from a management stack perspective, you're having to manage everything from the operating system to potentially if it's on-prem, you're having to manage the physical infrastructure as well. So moving towards PaaS or SaaS, as Jamie said, is a path to modernization. So freeing up critical and limited IT resources to be able to focus on more higher value tasks for the organization is really kind of how I summarize it and how I view modernization, because the commodity service of managing virtual machines, patching the OS, those sort of things, that's about keeping the lights on for the organization. It's not really moving the organization forward and adding value. So technology, being able to leverage technology to do more, and really build automation, build whatever functions and features that you want that move you beyond just having to manage that.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that, Craig. So some efficiency, some simplicity, and actually getting more value out of the application and out of the opportunity of a cloud. Jamie, maybe a question back to you of unpacking those options a little more. And that first one of migration to the cloud, something that we see clients consider, and some do, in particular when they want to move quickly, is this thing AVS, Azure VMware Solution or Service. Maybe just tell us a bit more about that, and what are the scenarios where that absolutely makes sense, and then what are the scenarios where maybe there's a pause there and to think a little about some other alternatives?
Yeah, and you hit on a key term there, which is we need to migrate quickly. So there's potentially some sort of compelling event that's driving a customer to that. And a little bit to Craig's point a moment ago there, most customers would prefer to modernize, but they don't always have the time or the resources to get there. So often we may look at these things in phased approaches where we might just sort of do a step at a time to sort of align with the resources that a particular organization has. But Microsoft has had a very long-standing, very strong partnership with VMware over the years, and that continues with Broadcom. And so we have a solution that runs in Azure called the Azure VMware Service, or you'll hear us just simply refer to it as AVS, because we just love our acronyms at Microsoft. And the AVS service is fully managed infrastructure that's hosted and runs in the Azure data centers, but it's a full bare metal based solution that runs the VMware stack, VMware solution in our data center environment. And so this is effectively a solution that's sold and supported by Microsoft, but it's been jointly engineered and brought to market with VMware. So it runs all the native VMware solutions, vSphere, vSAN, NSX, those types of components from a VMware perspective. Now, the big advantage we get here is it's just the VMware environment. And so that means organizations can either lift and shift out of their current data centers running VMware into Azure without having to, retrain people in terms of how to manage and work with that environment. Or they can burst and expand, so they can make it complementary. This can just be another node or another data center that's part of an organization's current VMware cluster or environment. So it creates a really natural way for organizations to take the skill set that they have today, their understanding, their education, how they deploy and work within their IT environment, and just really laterally expand that into a public cloud offering at the end of the day. So it's straightforward, it's simple, it's easy. There's no retraining. You technically don't need to retest your applications, although I would always, really recommend that anytime you do any kind of major hardware, software change, you're going to go through an appropriate testing cycle to ensure everything has happened. But unlike, say, refactoring something from running in VMware, where maybe you're picking up and even doing a migration or a lift and shift to IaaS, there's a certain amount more of the environment that is now changed when you do a traditional lift and shift that requires a little bit more due diligence and testing to ensure it's put in place. That's significantly lower when you look at running in this environment. It would be no different than doing a traditional data center migration from point A to point B with the same environment. So that allows for that speed, that agility you mentioned right away, Sean, in terms of we can actually do this pretty quickly at the end of the day.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Jamie. And so, Craig, maybe a question to you of kind of looking at it from both sides of what might be some scenarios where AVS is the right path. And Jamie touched on speed. And then conversely, what might be some drivers to say, actually, I want to embrace the modernization, then migration type approach versus migrate and then figure the rest out later? Maybe just talk to us a bit about that.
For sure. Yeah. So the speed is definitely one factor. So you have a pending data center contract that's coming up for renewal. You don't have the time to analyze all the applications, all the workloads, and make sure they're compatible with going to another route, whether it's Azure native VMs or otherwise. So that is definitely a factor. But being able to take it to another step and identify what is the investment that the company has made in terms of tooling or skilling around VMware. Maybe there's some automation that is critical to your DR strategy or something that is baked into the VMware stack on-prem. You don't have to worry about, you might have to test it as Jamie mentioned, but you don't have to worry about reinvesting in that tooling and restructuring everything because AVS is compatible with VMware on-prem as well. So that's, I think, number one. Looking at the skilling and tooling is also a factor. And then onto the modernization, as Jamie said, some companies want to migrate to the cloud for various different reasons, but they're not ready to modernize. So, one example is we've got a customer who is in colo. They've got many VMs, but they've also got many in-house built applications. And we've talked to them about migration to get ready, get it into Azure, but they want to take a slower approach. They're actually more interested in modernize as they go, not just refactor. It's complete rewrites in some cases of the application. So that enables them to take advantage of PaaS, platform as a service, other cloud native technologies and solutions, infrastructure as code for automated deployments, those sort of things. So they made a conscious decision to not do a lift and shift and migrate VMs, so like for like, and replicate that into Azure. They're modernizing as they go. So I think it's I always look at it as there's no one size fits all for any particular customer. We want to come in, understand the requirements, understand the drivers, business drivers behind why moving to the cloud is important to you as an organization, and then come up with the appropriate plan for to tackle that.
Right. Thanks, Craig. I want to come back to the title of our show here around managing the VMware license costs themselves. So, Jamie, maybe a question back to you. When we think about the different options, and we can unpack a couple more here as we go around Azure Stack and leveraging Arc and things like that. But if we pin it back to that key question that the clients had on their mind of, okay, I got like, are my VMware license costs, are they going to rise? How do I manage that? Can you talk a little bit about how a client can insulate themselves and have predictability to those costs through some of these options?
Yeah, for sure. And I think predictability is the key word there. At the end of the day, is aligning those costs to sort of the timeframes that make sense for organizations from a budget perspective, or just to understand what their costs are going to be like for the next few years. We have a concept in Azure called reserved instances. And so this is a concept that's been around for quite some time, where you actually have an ability to say, hey, I'm going to deploy a virtual machine. It's a stable workload for me. So in order to gain some better predictability in your costs, as well as some discounted savings, you can issue what's referred to as a reservation. And so generally those are a 1-year or a 3-year reservation, where you commit to deploying that particular virtual machine for 1 year or for 3 years. In exchange, we give you those discounts because it really gives us predictability in our data center capacity, which is sort of huge from the operating costs that we endure in the cloud. And so that concept of reservation actually extends as well into AVS. And so we have an ability to allow you to make reservations for your AVS nodes so that you can actually have predictability in what it's going to cost you for 1 year, 3 years, or with AVS, we actually have a 5-year reservation option that's currently available. Now, in both in the reservation scenarios, you actually are getting that pricing predictability. So if you go to the extreme here and say, hey, I want to reserve an AVS environment for 5 years, that's basically going to give you pricing protection for the next 5 years. So you can deploy those nodes. You can know exactly what your prices are going to cost you for the next 5 years. And inside of AVS, we actually have 2 options. One option is to purchase the licensing, the VMware licensing, as part of the AVS environment, or you can bring your own licenses from on-prem into Azure. Now, we're pretty unique in the market in terms of our ability to bring your own VMware licensing to Azure, and it's a relatively new capability as well. And so you've kind of got both options on the table. What's really good about the environment that we have set up is you could do something like a 5-year AVS pricing. You could use our licensing. And so now basically what you've done is not only do you now have fixed pricing for your hardware for the next 5 years, as well as the fixed licensing cost for that particular hardware for the next 5 years. So that can give you the ultimate pricing predictability. But coming back to the concept of why organizations would want to sort of make this move, most are probably not going to be like, hey, I want to lock into this deployment pattern for the next 5 years. They're likely going to want to move towards some of the things we talked about, such as, hey, I actually want to modernize this. I want to move this over to something else down the road, but just not right now. But I want that predictability from a licensing perspective. And so we do have an ability to do exchanges on our reservations. There's some restrictions and limitations in terms of what can we exchange for what, but there is the option to basically say, hey, move me off of VMware compute over to a traditional infrastructure compute. And so that now allows organizations to say, okay, lock me in for 5 years, but still give me the flexibility to make modifications away from the AVS environment as my needs evolve over time. And so that predictability, that consistency in pricing, as well as pretty aggressive discounts. We've got some special promos that are in place through the end of the year that really make this a very compelling cost exercise. But ultimately, coming back to what you were sort of saying, Sean, which is it's going to give customers predictability in what their costs will be for a particular deployment.
Right. Thanks for that, Jamie. I want to go a little deeper into the different options at the top of this. Jamie, you talked about kind of the big 3 of you could migrate, you could do something hybrid, or you could modernize, or kind of versions of all of that in between. I want to talk a little bit more around hybrid and what that looks like, what options a client could consider there, Azure Stack HCI. How does that fit into the thoughts of considerations, and Azure Arc, and what are the points to consider there?
Yeah, well, let's start with the basic one, which is when we think about this in the context first of AVS, and then I'll jump to Stack and Arc and a few of the others. But when we think about it just from the context of AVS, having an on-prem VMware cluster that's now connected to an AVS cluster inside of Azure, where the two are working together, it might just be capacity. One might be a failover, like you may have a single deployment on-prem, but you would like to have a redundant or secondary data center. This AVS can basically run in a limited 3-node state and then allow you to spike up based on an outage where you need more capacity. And so that can be a very cost-effective way of running a secondary data center to your primary data center. But that is a form of hybrid computing where we're primarily running on-prem, but we can fail over to run inside of an AVS environment. And so that's, I think, one of the powerful ways of having a resilient hybrid environment set up at the end of the day. The other option that customers will look at is they say, okay, well, we like the idea of having that kind of hybrid environment, or maybe they've sort of fully gone or intended to go fully towards a traditional infrastructure as a service environment. They're maybe going to pull away from a traditional VMware deployment model. They want to start to embrace Azure management capabilities. They want to start to manage their environment directly from the Azure portal. And so we have a solution called Azure Arc that allows us to basically install an agent on your virtual machines running on-prem. And what that does is that enables or lights up those virtual machines to be seen from the Azure management plane itself, from the Azure portal. And so now you can start to manage those virtual machines. You can now secure those virtual machines with things like Defender for Server being deployed down to those machines on-prem. But you're basically now treating your on-prem virtual machines like you would Azure virtual machines and managing and controlling them from the Azure environment itself. So that's using Azure Arc. The other option is you might be in a scenario where it's like, okay, great. I like the idea of what you're describing there in terms of managing my on-prem environment from Azure, but I don't want to use VMware as my hypervisor layer. I actually want to go with a full Microsoft solution. And that's actually where Azure Stack comes into the picture, where now we can basically deploy Azure Stack on hyperconverged infrastructure, or you can acquire hyperconverged infrastructure with Azure Stack pre-installed. From some of our hardware partners like Dell, Lenovo, and HP. And this will allow you to now basically stand up your own sort of mini Azure environment, if you would, so that when we go into the Azure portal, we now see that Azure Stack devices as a set of nodes and resources that now can be managed and deployed from the Azure portal itself. Now, you can also manage locally. You don't actually have to go to the cloud to do it, but you can sort of just manage locally if you're in a situation where you're sort of network constrained or not going to public internet. But the concept is still there. How do you sort of take the best of Azure's resource manager control plane and now bring that down into your on-prem environment? So these sort of give us a kind of ultimate flexibility. We can burst and bridge with AVS running in Azure. We can basically take Azure services and come back in a lightweight way with Azure Arc, or we can go more full on with Azure Stack as the hypervisor replacement tier at the end of the day.
That's a great overview and summary there, Jamie. Pardon me, Craig. Maybe something back to you around. It's a great discussion around different ways to approach it, and something I keep thinking about here is that modernization is, like Craig, you spoke about a client that we work with. That modernization is the priority, right? And I think generally clients are trying to get there of whatever that means to them, right? And it might mean something different for different clients for different reasons. But maybe just talk a little bit about clients that may not have the in-house skill sets yet. And they're enthusiastic about that, but they don't quite have all the pieces. What would you suggest of how they might think about approaching that?
Yeah, great question. It again, one size does not fit all. So it depends on the situation. But I think back to what we've said already in this call is, if a client has a huge investment in tooling around VMware, they don't have the skills in Azure yet, but they want to move in that direction. AVS is a good alternative to get them there without having to make any investments in tooling or what have you. But then also, if you look at, like I can think of another customer example where time was of the essence. They weren't running on VMware in this particular case. They were actually in a colo. They didn't have management of the hypervisor. So, but they had a 3-month window before their data center contract was up, and they didn't have the Azure skills, but they're like, we need to go to Azure. They weren't tied to VMware. So we went with Azure native VMs in that scenario. But what we did is we also onboarded them into our managed services so that they had that certainty that the environment would be managed and they didn't have to invest. And day one, all their team needs to know how to manage this environment in Azure. So we do a co-managed service and we manage alongside their team. And this was 3 years ago. This customer is still a managed service customer of ours, but they see the value in working alongside us, and their team can focus on those high value tasks. Now, obviously, 3 years later, they're definitely up to speed on the Azure management layer, and they can manage it, but they choose to still also leverage us for kind of that low value management, patching the VMs and so on. They haven't chosen to modernize. They may or may not still go down that path. But they wanted to get out of the data center business, and that was the option that they followed. So,
yeah, thanks for that, Craig. So, yeah, trying to help clients think about ways to move quickly and make some progress around modernization, almost regardless of where their in-house skill sets are, and helping them evolve and upskill as they go. Maybe a question, Craig, that'll segue us into more of the kind of architecture design thinking between yourself and Sabrina. A good segue question would be, do you see AVS as a PaaS solution, as a platform solution, or do you see it more as an IaaS solution? Let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah, it's I would say it's a PaaS service that's offering IaaS on top of it, if you want to think of it that way. But it is by definition a platform as a service, because Microsoft is managing all the physical layer, all the networking, the hypervisor, so on and so forth. That is provided to you as a platform that you can layer on then your operating system, your applications, and your management layer. So, from a definition of PaaS, it is that service, and it's a turnkey service that essentially you now don't have to manage. So comparing it to, say, the on-prem VMware, where you still have to manage the hypervisor, you have to manage the physical infrastructure, all that sort of thing. It is a PaaS offering of that VMware service.
Okay, thanks, Craig. That makes sense. Sabrina, I'd like to bring you into the conversation here. We have heard the term "it depends" come up multiple times here. And so when you think about all this in different client scenarios, what would you recommend from an approach standpoint to take the fuzzy "it depends" comment to, okay, let's figure out a plan that's right for you? How it maybe offer the audience a little bit of thought around how we'd go about that to make that clearer for them.
Absolutely, Sean. Usually, there are different requirements and the different reasons for the customers to want to move to Azure native services or AVS, depending on what they have in the environment, the requirements, and the changes that they're going through. So we usually suggest to go through a very detailed assessment. Microsoft provides us with many great assessment tools, which we use on a daily basis. It could be from the well-architected framework assessment tools, and then we get to Azure Migrate. Azure Migrate tool allows us to do an assessment for an on-premises environment running or just different clouds. And we do have a lot of customers that use VMware, and they don't know which way to go. If they don't have a time constraint, like, if they do, we do an assessment, and the first answer is to move to AVS if there's a time constraint. But if there is not, they're just not sure how things will look like and how much everything will cost when they go to Azure. So we use the Azure Migrate tool. We perform multiple assessments. One of them will be to Azure native cloud and VMs and services. and the other one will be an AVS assessment. Both assessments provide us with a lot of useful details so that we can help the customers make the right decision for them, something that works for them. These assessments provide us with details like based on the performance, what's the right size, what's the right SKU for everything. Can I modernize some of these applications that I have, my databases, my web apps, and what will my bill look like every month from Azure? And that's the big question for everyone. And what are the saving plans that I can use? How much I have software assurance? How much will this cost if I have Azure Hybrid Benefit, if I use that, or reserved instances? And using this tool, we will be able to produce multiple assessments that give us all of these details that we need to create this big picture for a customer with their concerns, their requirements. It's not it's of course, as you all mentioned, sometimes the customer needs to exit a data center, some changes in the business. Sometimes they already have a little bit of footprint in Azure, and they love their VMware, and they just introducing some new cloud services that they need at least a part of their VMware environment to be closer to that location in Azure. So to avoid latency, to be more technical. So, hey, we want to use AVS, and something that we always talk about in well-architected framework is the shared responsibility. So from on-premises, the more we move into towards IaaS and PaaS, we share this responsibility with Microsoft, with our cloud provider. So they will take care of our hardware. If you move towards PaaS, for example, for SQL managed instances for AVS, you don't need to worry about patching and updating a lot of this solutions. You don't need to worry about the hardware, and we need to go through these assessments to find the right balance that works for every business case for our customers. So that's how we usually propose to start a project at Invero, and we provide the results and all the insight from these great tools that are available to us.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sabrina. So back to kind of it depends. Well, the best way to figure that out is to do a thorough assessment, leverage all the great tools out there. Often there's some funding capability to help a client get that part done at little or often sometimes no charge. So that's a fairly easy part to tackle and get, and then it really paints that picture. Maybe just talk a little about what happens next. So now we've done an assessment, we've come up with the different options. Where do you see we go from here in terms of helping clients on that journey?
So based on the assessment results and existing environment of the customer, being maybe some of them already have some footprint in Azure and some of them don't, based on the requirements that they have, and usually the cloud adoption framework practice that we go through. After the strategy is defined and the planning, and then we get to the readiness. Are they ready to go to Azure? So if they want to go to Azure native solutions and migrate to Azure native virtual machines and services, usually we have to assess and make sure that either if a customer doesn't have a footprint, we work on the right foundation to create a proper Azure landing zone for them and go through design workshops with them. And if they already have some, we'll just do a review and make the right adjustments so that it works. And if the decision is to go to AVS, again, we use the results. We know what clusters, nodes, and SKUs are required. We create that and use the migration tools that are available and do the migration. A lot of times, these are will stay hybrid. Sometimes the customer decides to go all in the cloud, and they're ready to do that depending on the skill set of their staff, their IT staff, and how they want to manage this. Sometimes there's enough time to get some training, sometimes there isn't. If there isn't, usually the AVS is the answer. It's great. They don't need to deal with so many complexities that they have with data centers, hardware refreshments, even licensing. Microsoft will take care of all of that for them. And sometimes they need to go to some Azure native services, but again, when they don't have the right skill set, they come to partners like us, and we provide them managed services, and we help them manage their environments. We even help them train their staff. So all of this will be the next step. And once everything is migrated as planned, we will help the customers with governance, management, and constant securing and optimizing the environment. And we put the right guardrails in the environment using, again, different solutions that are available to us from Microsoft. Azure Native, we use a lot of Azure policies. And for hybrid environments, we use Azure Arc, which helps us and the customers to manage everything under a single pane of glass, whether it's on-prem, AVS, and Azure, and everything can be managed under one platform without introducing multiple tools into the environment for automation and a lot of manual work.
Yeah, so maybe let's just go a little deeper on that, on the ARC piece here of how that plays into the conversation. And you've already started that a little bit there, Sabrina. Maybe we just go a little further into how we're seeing maybe some kind of best practice examples of how clients are leveraging ARC to their benefit.
Absolutely. Well, just the Arc, Azure Arc, which I'm sure most of our audience are familiar with it, is a bridge that extends all of these great Azure management services from the Azure platform into their environments, regardless of what infrastructure they're running on, either different clouds, on-premise environments running on Hyper-V, VMware, physical servers, and Stack HCI. We had customers that they were very much interested in using Azure services because they had a small footprint in Azure. They really loved how everything was managed there. They had a lot of challenges on-prem managing with multiple tools from different vendors, and things kept changing with those third-party tools that they used, and sometimes they were not compatible, and they were always telling us, oh, we wish that we could just simplify everything like our small Azure environment. And they were not really ready to fully migrate to Azure at that point because they still had up-to-date and a pretty good hardware on-prem that they wanted to leverage and then plan for migration to Azure when it was closer to end of life for that hardware, which made sense. They had made that investment there. So we suggested Azure Arc to them, and we helped them. And the environment was actually running on VMware, and with a lot of new features that have been added to Azure Arc recently, they could onboard their entire vCenter at scale using the new features that these Azure Arc offers now with onboarding your entire vCenter, which automates the onboarding and offboarding of everything that is going on in your on-prem. And they leveraged a lot of management from Azure. They extended some security features from Azure. They used tagging for some automation for their on-premises environment, and they used update management, which was amazing for them, and they really liked that. And we were very happy to watch them experience that. And now they've started to expand their footprint in Azure, introducing some new services. We're helping them with some app modernization, and that's all encouraging them to move to more towards Azure as their hardware is also aging on-prem.
So very much an iterative journey, and to your point, clients are at different moments in time of their investments and the age and life cycle of those investments of on-premise hardware. I want to just flip a little bit to, you talked about landing zones and governance and how important that is in general, but also when we think about this journey. Something, Sabrina, you and I, we work with so many clients together and think about that landing zone as really like a foundation of your house, right? Like if that's solid, you can build on top of it. And if it's not, it's probably not the right time to think about modernizing the on-suite if the foundation isn't quite there. And then the other thing that goes hand in hand is that piece around governance, and they tie in closely with the well-architected point of view, right? Something that I think about often would be in, I'll say, a legacy world, go back 10, 20 years kind of thing, or even currently, clients are on-prem and they decide they need more compute power. And so they go through this cycle of realizing that, working with the procurement group generally, making a requisition to add more capacity, make a spend, go out and do whatever kind of procurement they might do. And then eventually they make a purchase of additional servers and they ingest it into their environment. In the world of cloud, that's much faster. And that's at a click of a button, which creates tremendous efficiency, but it also can create some chaos. So maybe let's just talk a little bit, kind of skim the top around governance and how to help clients think about that from that kind of old world to a modern world that creates speed and efficiency, but it can also create a bit of chaos, right?
Absolutely. It is very important to, whenever any of our customers talk to us about just adopting cloud or moving more towards cloud or completely to the cloud, it is important to have the right policies and guardrails there. Back in the days, whenever we wanted to add hardware, we had to go through a process of purchasing them and approvals and all that. But now in Azure, in 2 minutes, you can just spin up everything. And then if you don't have the right guardrails and policy, the Azure bill can just go high. And then next month, everybody will be shocked when they get the bill. So it's very important to have those. And at the same time, talking about Azure landing zones, it is very important when it comes to design of your foundation to think about an environment that is going to change, that is going to scale out. Maybe something changes and it even becomes smaller. You never know what the future will bring for a business. But it is very important to follow the cloud adoption framework and all the recommendations and the design areas so that once you follow that, you will be able to make these changes properly in your environment to scale out if you need to. But if you don't follow those, you might have to take a step back, make really aggressive changes that will cost the customer a lot of money because their business has to go down. These changes are complex. But once you follow that, we will not have those complexities because you follow the framework, everything. There is a plan for scaling out and making changes. You can isolate things, and it has been properly done. So it's a very important step to follow, and just to always monitor and have the right governance in place to manage it. It is absolutely important. Apart from all of this, something else that you mentioned is how flexible it is for customers to add resources, and we have seen that we have some customers that provide some services that are seasonal and they have different requirements for different times of year, and they need to increase their resources. They need to scale up. And that's the same thing if you have AVS or Azure native environment. It is much easier to do that. Let's say you have 4 weeks of an event, an online event, and you need more resources, and you scale up. And then once that's done, you can just scale back down, and you don't have to invest in hardware that you cannot use after that, and it's going to get old until next year when the season's back. So it's great to leverage these flexibilities and services that we can get from the cloud.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Sabrina. I want to bring it back full circle here. We're starting to wrap up on the show and the time we have. The whole intent really was to talk about managing those licensing costs, right? And then architectures and opportunities and benefits that go with that. And we talked high level around migrations. You could leverage AVS, and I think we provided a lot of clarity there around, Jamie, you did around how the clarity and the predictability that a client would have around their licensing cost. Similarly, if a client was to take more of a modernization first approach, they're freeing themselves of VMware, like basically altogether. So then therefore there's there's really not so much there, and it's really managing the reserved instances and the hybrid use benefits and the programs within Microsoft, which we can help clients get on their front foot and do a great job there. I want to come back to that kind of third scenario there, where the client has recently invested in hardware and it's not life cycled yet, so they got to see that through, and they're thinking, okay, I gotta see the value of that. Arc may be my control plane solution here, but I want to come back to how does a client get the predictability of VMware licensing through that approach? Can I bring that question back to you, Jamie?
So when it comes to on-prem hardware, right? If they want predictability in VMware licensing, that's going to be a scenario where they got to go work with VMware on that side. But the one thing that we can actually do is talk about the Microsoft licensing that may run in that environment as well. And one of the other popular things that both Arc and AVS, as well as natively running in Azure, do bring up is the ability to support legacy versions through our extended security update patchings that we have. So think, older 2012 versions of Windows and SQL, right? And so that pay per use model extends down into your on-prem environment when you're using Arc or using Stack on-prem, or you get that benefit with AVS, or you get that benefit just running in Azure native. And I think that's an important area to kind of focus on, because we do run into, again, older solutions that organizations haven't had the time to upgrade to newer versions, or maybe it's dependent on a software version that's a little bit outdated of a software solution that won't allow them to upgrade yet. So there's various different reasons where that comes into play that can sort of help. And ensure that you're really running with the most secured versions of those particular solutions as we can. And then I think the other thing that's really interesting is when you've got that hardware that hasn't fully depreciated, you do, assuming it's hyper-converged hardware, you do have the ability to consider running Stack on that existing hardware. So that might be an option to sort of say, hey, could I upgrade and use Stack as my hypervisor instead of VMware? That could be an option worth sort of exploring with customers at the end of the day as another alternative, right?
Yeah, for sure. So many options. To our audience, I hope this has given you some nuggets of value and some clarity and some perspective of different ways to think about the problem statement, different ways to approach it. In that spirit of every scenario is a little different, like let's talk about how can Invero help you kind of think about what to do next. And I'm just going to pop up a slide here. This is something that we do. We've been doing this for lots and lots of clients, and it's really effective and really successful. And in partnership with Microsoft, we're generally able to do this at no charge for a client, which is to dive deep and help figure this out for you. Figure out where are you at, what investments have you made, what applications are you running, what is the compatibility to move them, to modernize them, to not, what urgency might you have, all those kind of things we just talked about and more. And then Sabrina and our technical team here will leverage tools, leverage their experience, and come out with some options for you, and then talk through those options so you've got that clarity that's really specific to your environment. So if you're thinking about, this has all been great, it's interesting, but now what we would invite and encourage you to do is work with us and let us help you out for that. Generally, it's not even a charge, because we can just help you figure out what's the right plan for you, and it might have iterations and versions of it. But we would always recommend doing that assessment, look under the hood, and then build a roadmap. And that's something that we're excited to do. We're very experienced at doing, and help you figure out the most efficient way to do that while managing those VM costs. This has been a great show. Jamie, Sabrina, Craig, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much. As always, I always learn a ton just chatting with all of you. Jamie, thanks so much for your support today and the ongoing partnership with Microsoft Canada. We're having a ton of fun working together and serving clients coast to coast. And to our audience, thank you for investing time. I hope you got some value out of this. Have a great afternoon and have a great long weekend, everybody. Thank you all for joining the Invero Show today.